for a moment of silence to remember those that have fallen since the last time we met. Okay, thank you. And the minutes are included in your packet of the August 28th meeting.
Motion to accept.
Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Are there any comments, additions, or corrections? Okay, seeing and hearing none, all those in favor of accepting the minutes as proposed, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
It's working.
Did everybody end up voting online?
What's that?
Record your votes. No. Refresher. Okay. For some reason. Oh. Okay. We're going to take a look at your agenda here. We're going to move item number 6 next, and then we will have item number 2 after that. did. I couldn't even open it.
Mr. Chair, item 6 will require motions.
Moved up on number.
Number 6, item number 6, which is our board and administrative committee elections.
Sorry, so that would be me.
Could.
There'll be at least 3 motions, Glenn, not just you.
There we go. Well, Steve, direct us here. So Paul and I have been talking. We have a third employer member. And those two, Paul and David Klein, need to chat before they can really determine, because I will not be on the administrative committee. One of those two will. Paul probably will be, but we haven't had a chance to talk with David. We don't have enough people here to really determine that. So can we move that, or how do we move that election till November and just keep the status quo until then?
Yes, if you move to defer that, the administrative committee election to November, then with the consent of the board, that would be the appropriate way to handle that. So that would take a motion and an affirmative vote of the board.
Then I do move to move the election till November.
The election for the administrative committee member.
Correct.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing and hearing none. All those in favor of the motion to table the administrative committee employer representative, please signify, or please vote on your.
We're done.
Okay, and that motion carries.
Thank you.
All right, other motions for the chair and vice chair. Sure.
Did we nominations last month?
Yes. So if there are any other nominations, this would be the appropriate time for that. If there are no other nominations, then you would move to elect.
Okay, Mark.
I move to elect Kelly Fox as chair.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
All right, are there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all in favor of that motion, please signify, or please vote on your pad. Okay, and that motion carries. Okay, it's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please document your vote on your iPad.
I think that's just a fine idea, but I can't find it on my iPad.
This one is from the last motion. Okay. Motion carries. That concludes item number 6. Now we'll move to item number 2 and ask for Steve to introduce.
Mr. Chair, as you'll recall, and for all board members, the Left Plan 2 board is statutorily required to conduct an annual audit of expenses. Most small state agencies are audited on a less frequent basis by the state auditor. In between the years where the state auditor conducts the audit of the Left 2 board, the board contracts with an independent auditor to perform that audit. This year, Steve Davis conducted the audit. He's conducted those similar audits for the board in the past, and he's here this morning to speak to the results of the audit. With that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
There we go. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Board, Steve. As Steve Nelson just indicated, my name's Steve Davis, and I've been doing this audit for a number of years. And I believe that you have already received a copy of the audited schedule of expenditures with my opinion letter. So I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time going over that schedule of expenditures, other than to say, for the biennium, the Plan 2 board schedule of expenditures was under budget in total for the biennium. There was one line item that was over budget by about almost 3%, and that was the cost of the AG for the biennium. Other than that, there's really nothing else to point out on the schedule. I do, however, have some items that I'd like to bring to the board's attention that were noted during the audit. These items I've discussed with management, and I think the plan's in place to fix some of these things. None of these items I consider to be a finding or anything of significance. They had no impact on my opinion on the schedule of expenditures, but were just items that, could be something that management should look into and try to fix. So with that being said, I would like to go over a letter that you should have received this morning. I think it was passed out. It's dated September 25th. And I'm just going to go over some of the highlights. On the first page, under significant audit findings, I want to point out that it says in this letter that there were no new accounting policies that were adopted, and the application of the existing policies had not changed during the year, and that we noted no transactions entered into by the organization during the year for which there was a lack of authoritative guidance or consensus. That's just a required communication I have to make to you. These are kind of standards that have evolved since the Enron scandals and other scandals after that, just to let you know when you're looking at the financial statements, if there was a significant change in how they do accounting, and you try to compare your financial statements to a previous year, if you're not aware of that substantial change, it makes it difficult for you to analyze your statements. Down under difficulties encountered in the performance of the audit, I'm just going to read this section. It says, we encountered no significant difficulties in dealing with management in performing and completing our audit. However, we did encounter some difficulties in performing our audit procedures due to the lack of documentation related to differences between the board's and staff's original documentation and actual postings into the accounting transactions into AFRS by the Department of Enterprise Services. And AFRS is just the statewide accounting and reporting system. These differences and the inability for us to initially perform all of our audit procedures on those transactions was primarily due to the fact that the process went from a paper trail transactions to a paperless system. And in the past, any changes that were made by DES, which was in prior years, OFM, would be documented on the original documentation, sent back to staff here to be filed and reconciled. With the paperless, a lot of that tended to be more due to email conversations and so forth, which sometimes may or may not have been attached to the original documentation. So as we were doing our audit, we'd look at the documentation here, go trace it into the accounting records for the state and say, well, why can't I find this, or why are these amounts different? And so it took us a little bit of effort to get to that. I would like to point out that there were no instances where we were not able to satisfy ourselves that the difference was warranted. Okay, some examples of differences that you would normally see are on a travel expense voucher. Somebody maybe picked up the wrong per diem rate, wrong mileage rate, or the addition was incorrect, or what have you. And when it gets to DES, their accountants there review these documents and they say, wait a minute, this isn't correct, and they would change it. And again, because we are going paperless, it was not necessarily changed on the documentation that was here on file at the board. On the second page, there's a section in the middle of the letter that says other audit findings or issues. And I just want to point out a couple of things here, that we did identify the following matters which, although not significant enough to affect our opinion on the schedule of expenditures, were deemed important enough to communicate to management. And since I had to I felt that I needed to communicate them to management, I am required to also inform the board of that communication. The first item was that we did notice some instances where credit card purchases were only supported by the signed sales receipt. And, that's good. But when you're purchasing something at a restaurant, let's say you're at a conference, you're out of town, and you purchase something at a restaurant, there are regulations with the state that prohibit you from purchasing alcohol and other items. And those credit card receipts that you sign do not indicate what was purchased. It just says where it was at and the date. So we do recommend to management that in the future, not only do you attach the signed credit card receipt, but you also get the detailed receipt of what was ordered at that restaurant or whatever it is that you purchased, so that you can demonstrate compliance with those state regulations. The second item, we did notice numerous transactions which, in my opinion, were posted to the incorrect expenditure code in the statewide accounting system. Now, in most of these cases, it had absolutely no impact on your schedule of expenditures, because the statewide accounting system that keeps track of numerous levels of detail. So you might have supplies on your schedule of expenditures, but there may be 10 different types of supplies expense categories that roll up into that one line item on your schedule of expenditures. So for my opinion on the report, those instances would not affect my opinion, because the number stays the same on the financial statements when we roll up all that detail. However, for transparency purposes, it is really important that things get classified properly. So I've given some examples of the items that I felt could be situations where, if this were to occur on a regular basis, or end up adding up to a large dollar amount, could be important to a citizen who might do a public records request, or somebody like that. So here are the items I picked. We noticed that 20 expenditures for temporary contract staffing were charged to other contractual services. On the surface, that sounds okay, no problem. But there is a category for temporary staffing, contractual temporary staffing. The importance for keeping that separate, in my opinion, is that, as we've seen in the past few years, there are times when there are prohibitions against hiring new staff and so forth. And so one way to possibly get around that is to do contract staffing. Well, if it's not clearly demonstrated or recorded to those accounts, somebody looking to see if you've complied with that requirement would not see the full picture. So just recommend that in the future, any temporary staffing get coded to that proper account. The next item was we noticed 6 expenditures for the cost of food or beverages, which were recorded to a couple of different expenditure accounts. One was employee development and training, and the other one was travel and subsistence. So in many cases, it was food, coffee, refreshments for these meetings, or it could be a meeting elsewhere. Now, again, on the surface, it's not that big of a deal, but somebody who might say, you know what, I think that the board is spending too much money on food and light refreshments, and I want to know how much that was. If they did a public records request, they would not, again, see the full picture there. So I just recommend that, in my opinion, those items should go into, there is a cost category called light meals and refreshments. And so, again, not a big deal, had no impact on my opinion. And then the final one was there was 3 expenditures for dues and subscriptions, which were also coded to employee development and training. These would be other or dues into membership organizations that deal with retirement plan, actuarial type stuff, those types of things. Memberships aren't really training and development of staff. They may help in that, but there is a category called dues and subscriptions in the statewide accounting system. The final item that I wanted to point out, and this one was maybe the most significant of them, is that we did notice that an employee's reimbursement for tuition towards a college degree program was not treated as a taxable fringe benefit on the W-2 for the employee. All the paperwork was there. I think, and I've talked with Gwen, who is also here from Department of Enterprise Services, that perhaps there's something that can be changed on the form that agencies fill out requesting this tuition reimbursement be paid. There's no indication on this form whether it's taxable or non-taxable, and I'm not going to go into the specifics, but certain types of tuition are a taxable fringe benefit, others are not. And it's kind of a complicated deal. It would be nice if the form had a little box that staff here could check saying this is a taxable fringe benefit, and next to that box some examples of these are taxable and these are not, so that it does get on the employee's W-2. So those are the things that we came up with during the audit. I know that management has worked through this with Department of Enterprise Services. I know that they've involved me. I've discussed it with Gwen, who, as I said, is here as well, and we've come up with some ideas. They know the transactions that I'm talking about, and so forth. So I think that there's a good plan in place. Management didn't just blow this off; they took the bull by the horns, and it's being addressed. So, if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
Any questions? Clear as mud.
Steve, thank you for your work, and Gwen, I appreciate your work as well, and I appreciate you being here available for the board to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Steve.
With that, Mr. Chair, item 3 on the agenda is the results of the economic experience study. As you'll recall, this is I'm not going to, you'll see my name's behind it on the agenda. That is not because I intend to present on the results of the economic experience study. The Office of the State Actuary is here to answer any questions if board members have them. But The key piece I wanted to point out is that the board is not, the recommendation of the state actuary is to keep the current long-term economic assumptions that were adopted by the board 2 years ago. So there is no recommendation to take any action. However, as I mentioned, if you have any questions about the report, which was provided in your materials, or about the recommendation, Lisa's here from the State Actuary's Office to answer those questions.
Anybody have any questions?
No.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. Great job.
She doesn't get off that easy. Item 4 on the agenda is a presentation from Lisa. As you'll recall, earlier this interim, the board asked whether or not the Office of the State Actuary would be willing to do some educational sessions, 2 in particular, and they agreed. And so today's topic is a discussion of the actuarial funding method. As you'll recall, the statutory funding method for the LEOFF 2 board is what's known as the aggregate funding method. Lisa will be happy to explain that. But the board has adopted over the course of your 10 years of existence some temporary exceptions to that policy. And one of the questions came up is, what's the difference between entry age normal and aggregate, and whether or not the pros and cons, if you will, of considering a switch to entry age normal. Lisa's here to explain to you those differences and answer your questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa and Aaron.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Aaron Gutierrez with the Office of the State Actuary, and sitting next to me, as Steve introduced, is Lisa Wan also from our office. She's the Senior Actuary and also the Actuarial Services Manager for our office. We will be tag teaming this presentation today, and as I appreciate, Steve, the intro, this is just an educational briefing for the members. And I'd also like to note that we've put this together at a very high level. So if, for example, if there were other actuaries sitting in the audience, we might see hands up every few slides or so with a few extra details. We did do this at a very high level, designed for all audiences. As I mentioned, we'll be tag teaming this presentation today. I'll be taking the first 2 sections. What is a funding method and how do you select one? And then Lisa will be talking about 3 of the different funding methods, specifically entry age normal, the aggregate funding method, and of course the LEOFF 2's current board policy. So the first question, what is a funding method, or what is an actuarial cost method? Overall, these are just ways of setting aside money for the future. Now, we all know that at some point in the future, the benefits for the current employees will have to be paid, and there are just multiple ways, many standard and accepted methods for setting that money aside to make sure that it's available when it comes due. And there are multiple methods, so there is no single right way to do it. And a funding method is not the only consideration that goes into setting aside the contributions. It just happens to be one of the key elements in determining the amount and the timing of the contributions. So how much do you want to set aside? It's probably best to start with figuring out what is the total cost of all the benefits that need to be paid. Now that big circle represents the total costs that need to be paid in the future. Now, as you can see, the investment returns cover a very large portion of that. On average, we found for Washington's plans it's somewhere around 75%. That will vary by plan and, of course, by the retirement system, but around 75%. It also makes for a very good picture on a pie chart. Now, as you can tell, the darker slice there, that's the part that has to be contributed by both the member and employer over time. That dark slice is also what we call the present value of future benefits. Probably not an important term to retain. What's probably more important is this idea that if you took that slice, that darker slice, and invested it today, that would cover all of the cost of future benefits, assuming all of the assumptions are realized. So in other words, if you made that single payment today, that single upfront payment today, there would be no future contributions required of the system. And of course, as a budgeting matter, that's probably not realistic to put all of that money aside today. So instead, that's where the funding method comes in. So we have a list of some sample considerations for finding a funding method. Again, I mentioned earlier that there are lots of different standard and approved methods for funding. And so the board has the ability to choose whichever one best represents your values. And a couple different samples here. For example, if you wanted to maximize intergenerational equity, maximizing intergenerational equity would be spreading out as evenly as possible, spreading out the cost of the benefits for the people who are working today over their working lifetime, so that the future taxpayers and the future members are not paying for the cost of yesterday's benefits. There's also the opportunity to maximize investment earnings. I mentioned again that the earlier you make those payments, the earlier you make the payments, the more time you have to invest those contributions, and theoretically, the more you can earn on those contributions. Of course, that does, bring in additional risk as well. There's also the opportunity to manage yearly contributions, both balancing between the budget impacts and also the members' take-home pay. And there's also the chance to minimize volatility. We'll be talking about that a little bit more in Lisa's part of the presentation. And to fill out the samples, Washington State in statute has several funding goals for the other systems, and including fully funding the plans, intergenerational equity, which I just talked about, and also what we call systematic actuarial funding, or making regular payments over time. So to finish up my portion of the presentation, Lisa will now be talking about the three methods that I mentioned: the interage normal funding method, the aggregate funding method, and the current LEOFF board policy. But again, there are more methods that will not be covered in today's presentation.
Thanks, Aaron. Okay, now we get into the really exciting stuff. We're going to start with the entry-age normal funding method. And this one is a little bit more complicated than what you're used to. So it'll take a little bit longer to go through this one. And then when I'm done, we'll stop for some questions. And then we'll move through the aggregate and what the board policy is, because they're a little bit simpler. So under the entry-age normal funding method, the key important thing to remember is that funding method in total has two components. And this is some new information, I think, for the board. So that piece of the pie that Aaron was talking about that has to be contributed to the plan so that those investment returns can work for you, that piece of the pie under the entry-age funding method is broken into two components. One component for future costs and another component for past costs. Those future costs, we referred to those as the present value of future normal costs. And the past cost, that's the accrued liability, basically the benefits that have been allocated to past service. And ideally, those past costs have already been paid for by past contributions in a perfect world. So under this funding method, how much is set aside each year? What is that obligation from the employer and employee? Well, and it's an amount from each of those components. So an amount from the future costs and possibly an amount from the past cost. The future cost is 1 year of normal cost, and the past cost is some payment towards any unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And we'll talk about each of those components in a minute. Yes, Mark.
Question, so doesn't have
Correct. And we'll talk about that when we get into the aggregate and your method and pros and cons. So again, just to go back over this concept again, that big piece of the pie is you have a component from each of those in the entry age normal funding method. So let's look at each of those two components. So future costs and past costs. The first one, future costs. What is that normal cost? How is that determined? So if we take that piece of the pie, that quarter now, maybe less than a quarter, the future normal costs, that piece is going to be split into future annual amounts. Okay, so we take that pie, and you can see all the little slivers in there. It's split into future normal cost amounts. And it's determined by taking that total amount and dividing it by expected future salaries. And from that, you get a rate. And that's your normal cost rate. And that's something you're familiar with. We'll talk about that when we get to your board policy. But that becomes the normal cost contribution rate. Then each year, that rate is multiplied by that year's expected salaries to determine what your normal cost is. So that's the normal cost piece. And the normal cost under this funding method generally doesn't change. We'll talk about some of the reasons why it might. But when we have past investment return experience or other actuarial gains and losses from the past, those do not impact this normal cost. So it's a very stable and highly predictable rate, which is really nice for budgeting purposes. We've got a pretty stable normal cost rate. We can kind of count on, X percent of payroll for that normal cost. The other component, like Mark mentioned, you don't have in your funding method is the UAAL component. And how do we figure out that? So that's that other little slice of that pie. And the dark blue component is where we figure out what the UAL is. So from our past costs, so we've already talked about future costs. That's the normal cost piece. The past cost component, we take that and we say, okay, so these are our earned liabilities, this past component. How much of those earned liabilities have already been covered by assets? Anything that's left is an unfunded accrued liability. Okay? So our past costs, those are accrued liabilities. Anything that hasn't been already covered by assets is like a shortfall. It's an unfunded accrued liability, and we're going to need to make annual payments to pay that off. Now, when you have this component in a funding method, again, this is unique to the entry age versus aggregate. When you have this component, you also have to determine how are we going to amortize that unfunded liability. And that would be a decision that the board would make. An amortization period can be long, can be 20, 25 years, can be short, 10 or 15 years. It can be a fixed amortization. It can be rolling. So if you're interested in knowing what that means, fixed period, you'd have to keep track of each year's UAL and its fixed payment. Rolling, it just keeps being recalculated. So, as we know, there is volatility in our retirement systems because not all assumptions are perfectly met every year, including our investment returns. That's always an easy one to relate to. We may have expected 7.5% return on our investments. We may have gotten 9 or 4. So any volatility that happens under this funding method falls into that UAL. It's kind of considered past costs, right? What did happen versus what we expected. And when there's something different than what was expected, that volatility falls into those past costs, which come through in your UAAL. So if we have a bad economic experience, the assets in that piece of the dark piece of the pie, the dark blue piece of the pie, the assets might be smaller than those accrued liabilities. In that case, our UAL is positive and contributions have to increase to pay that off. On the other hand, if we're having a really good economic environment, the assets actually could be larger than that accrued liability. So when we're looking at that dark blue piece of the pie, the assets could be bigger than that entire dark blue piece. In that case, contributions would decrease because your UAL is actually negative or a surplus. Okay, so you could have a surplus for past costs. That surplus becomes a negative UAL, and that negative UAL will bring down your normal cost contribution amount. Okay, so your total contribution then becomes less than your actual normal cost because you've got a negative UAL in there. So that's kind of the difference you'll see with the entry age normal compared to what you've experienced in your plan. So we thought it might be helpful to have a look at what this might look like for LEOFF 2. I want to caution that this is highly estimated, but we wanted to go back to 2007 and say, well, what might the contribution rates have looked like for LEOFF 2 from 2007 and looking forward if you were under the entry age normal funding method. Now, we did have to make some assumptions mainly around the assets. So, and I did want to point out we did not use smoothed assets because we wanted you to be able to see that you could have a positive UAL. So if we had smoothed the assets, I think our UAL in this example would have all stayed negative, and we just wanted you to see that. So it's just an estimate, it's just to give you a sense of what this funding method would look like. So what we've got here are the two components. Your normal cost is that you can see fairly smooth, stable blue line up at the top, the thinner blue line up at the top. Your UAL, you can see in this case, is almost always negative, so almost always a surplus for your plan during this period and under the assumptions we used. And then you add them together to get the total cost that would be contributed for the year. Because again, under this funding method, you've got a normal cost component and a UAL component. In this case, the UAL is almost always bringing your total cost down. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense to everybody? So just to recap this funding method, that kind of 25% piece of the pie that Aaron had introduced is split into two components, future costs, past costs. Some of the benefits of this funding method is you have that stable normal cost rate. It can change, as I mentioned earlier. There are a few reasons that normal cost rate can change. If benefit provisions or assumptions change, then the normal cost, that calculation can change. And also it'll change slightly with as the demographics of new members come in. The downside of this funding method is it has a UAAL, and sometimes just having a UAAL can have negative connotations. And the volatility from the asset returns will go through that. Also, as I mentioned, you would have to make a decision as to how you would pay that UAL off. What is that amortization period? You have to select some kind of period, and depending on how you select it, it can weaken a goal of intergenerational equity. So, for example, if you selected a fixed 15-year period or rolling period, it's really not being spread over the working lifetimes of those current members that it applied to. So that's a recap on that funding method, and I'd like to stop for a minute because I know that was a lot to take in and take any questions.
Lisa, on slide 9, where you explained how you split up the normal cost into the future,
Yes.
How many years? If that's an amortization, I don't think it really technically is, but how many years do you spread it over?
It's actually spread over the expected future salaries of all current members.
But you split it into individual years, right? So it's
Actually, what we do, Glenn, is we take that whole chunk of costs that have to be paid for.
normal cost.
Yep, all the present value future normal costs. We take that amount of money, we spread it over all expected future salary of the current members, and that gives us a rate.
Right.
And then
how
that
long
rate,
is that future?
The working lifetime of the current members?
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on what the average age of the plan is. It's probably about 20 years might be that future, but it's whatever the expected career of all your current members.
And that changes as the plan ages.
Correct.
Got it.
Yes.
Also change depending upon.
That's correct. Yes, so the expected working lifetime for LEOFF Plan 2 would be shorter than, assuming they have the current members have a similar age at the time.
Makes sense.
Other questions?
Okay, I'll move on to a little bit simpler method, the aggregate funding method, and you're familiar with this as well. So if we go back to that earlier chart that Aaron introduced, where approximately 75% of costs are covered by investment returns, that remaining pie we've talked about is present value of future benefits. And under this funding method, it only has one component. So it's not split into two like under entry age. It has one component called the normal cost. And how is that normal cost determined? What is that annual contribution under this plan? From that big piece of the pie, that dark blue piece of the pie, which is the present value of future benefits, we subtract off all the assets of the plan. So these are all the future benefits that need to be paid, but we've already made some contributions. We already have some assets in there. We subtract off the current assets. What's remaining has to be paid by future contributions. Again, divide that by present value of expected future salaries, and there's your rate, and that's your normal cost rate. Okay? So what we'll find with this funding method, there's, again, like Mark brought up, no UAL component in the aggregate funding method, so that component doesn't exist, because any volatility that happens, anything that changes those assets or the liabilities is paid by normal cost. So it all gets rolled into the normal cost, one component. So here is, again, it's estimated, but not quite as estimated as the prior chart, because we have more information on the aggregate funding method, and we've applied the same smoothing method to the assets that you're currently using for your funding method. But you can see the comparison of the aggregate funding method to the entry age normal. The aggregate being the thicker blue line, and you can see that it has a little bit less volatility in it. Part of that comes from the smoothing of the assets, and you can see that the aggregate method in this example is higher than the entry age, because the entry age has that surplus in the UAL in this example that was bringing that total cost down. So as I mentioned, it was a fairly simple method, so not very many slides or background information. Aggregate, one component of plan costs, all rolled into the normal cost. Does not have a UAL, so that's a benefit to it. The downside is you do see the volatility in the normal cost. And the reason we're kind of talking about some of these things is it's building into what the board policy is, and how you've kind of taken some of those pros and cons and worked them together. So moving into the board policy. So this is the funding policy that has been adopted by the board. There really is kind of two policies in place. There's a long-term policy and a short-term policy. They're very similar. The underlying funding method is the aggregate funding method that I just talked about. And then you've included a contribution rate floor from one component of the entry age funding method, its normal cost. So you took one component of the entry age funding method, the normal cost component, which is that very stable rate, and you've adopted that as your rate floor. So no UAL component for your funding method that you've adopted, and you've added stability. So whereas the pure aggregate funding method had volatility in its normal cost, you've added stability in your normal cost by adopting the entry age normal cost as your floor. And that was that very stable rate from the entry age method. In addition, I don't want to forget this, you've also adopted an asset smoothing method, which I think will be an educational presentation later this interim on the smoothing method. So you've adopted that to also limit some of that annual volatility from investment returns. So two different things that you've included in your funding method to try and produce more stable rates. This next chart just kind of gives you the numbers behind some of this, and this is information that was presented last year to the board when you were faced with rate adoption. It's just showing the 11-13 rates that were adopted, and then at that time what we presented to you for 13-15 contribution rates, and it just allows you to see how those rates varied from the pure aggregate rate, and then adding the 90% floor, which would be your long-term policy, and then adding the 100% normal cost floor, which is what you've adopted for a short-term policy. And what's really telling is to look at this chart, which now is comparing all three of the funding methods we've talked about. And the thick, medium blue line, but the thicker line is the left two board policy, and you can see how much stability you have adopted in your rate by taking those different components. So to recap, the board has adopted a funding policy that uses parts of both funding methods. The plus, that you have no UAL under your policy. You've also minimized volatility in the normal cost. The downside could be potential overfunding of the plan, because you do have a rate floor, not a ceiling, but a rate floor, which could weaken the goal of intergenerational equity if it got to the point where it was continuing. So just kind of keeping an eye on whether it's 90%, 100% rate floor, and keeping an eye on that can help limit that potential for overfunding.
So just to summarize and bring this presentation to a close, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there are many funding methods available and different ways of setting aside funding today to pay the future benefits. And the board has the option of choosing the method that best represents your values. Lisa talked about the three different methods, the entry age normal funding method, the basic pros and cons. It does have a very stable normal cost, but it does allow the creation of an unfunded actuarial accrued liability. Under the aggregate funding method, the pros and cons, it does not create a UAL, but it does absorb the volatility in the normal cost. And finally, for the current board funding policy, it uses pieces of both of those methods. So there is no UAL created, and it does have a very stable normal cost, but there could be possible underfunding with potential weakening of the intergenerational equity. And so that concludes our prepared remarks.
Questions for Lisa or Aaron?
Thank you.
On the, thank you, that was a great presentation. I just had one quick question. The 8.46 contribution rate, is that, and I should know the answer to this, but is that on the gross earnings, or is that after taxes have been taken out, or is that?
The 8.4%, 8.46 rate for members would be applied to their gross earnings, or pensionable earnings. I'm not sure if there's maybe anything in there that's not pensionable, but they're pensionable gross earnings.
Yes. And that was the prior rate. I think currently it's 841.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
Can you go back to slide 20, the one, that one? If I could, a couple of questions. One of the things that I guess asked all the time in explaining how the board has been so successful in navigating the recent recession compared to some of your peer plans. I don't want you to miss the importance of this particular slide. There are a number of studies out there that show predictability in contribution rates is very helpful in allowing employers to fund their costs and avoids underfunding. Your rates have been remarkably stable and are predicted to remain remarkably stable. I don't know, does Matt get similar types of questions or from other actuaries or other funds around the country? I get them more from administrators in terms of how did you do it. And in the future, I'm going to keep this slide handy with a couple of some of your explanations because
As long as it has estimated on there, Steve, we're good.
Okay. And then the other thing is it's a combination of two different methods. You mentioned that there's remember a while back Kavanaugh was trying to get a copyright on some kind of actuarial funding method. Have you guys looked into the possibility of copyrighting this as well?
No, we haven't. But you're right. I mean, if you look at this chart, if the board was strictly at the aggregate funding method or the entry age normal funding method without any other combinations, even the aggregate funding method, if you look at that rate path, I mean, you would have been looking at like 5% contribution rate in 2008, expected to rise to 9.5% in 2016, 2017. That's a pretty large change, and that includes asset smoothing. So that rate path includes asset smoothing. So just adding that component of the entry age normal cost has really produced stability in your rates. And for anyone new, a few years back, we were expecting, even with your 90% rate floor in place, we were expecting a drop in contribution rates for a biennium or two, followed by an increase in rates because of the Great Recession. And that was, at the time, that's when the board adopted the 100% normal cost to try and just, forget about taking that dip, keep the rates up, and then that also brings future expected contribution rates down. So,
Mr. Chair. Paul, go ahead.
Lisa, I have a question. Maybe you could explain in more layman terms what possible overfunding, why that's causes a negative effect. You say it can weaken the goal of intergenerational equity. I'm not sure I understand that.
Okay, so intergenerational equity is just trying to say that today's members and taxpayers are paying for benefits of today's workers. So if you end up contributing more than the plan requires, which we would call overfunding, then today's taxpayers and members are paying for benefits for future members because you've paid more than what's required for current members. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Jeff?
That partially answered my question. I'll follow up afterwards. Thank you.
I have 3 questions in a row. Then they kind of link together. The first one is the present value of future benefits equal to the present value of future normal costs plus your accrued liability?
Correct.
So those are displayed proportionally on the graphs accurately. So what's in that accrued liability? What we have to owe, what people who are already retired?
What's in the yes, and also anything that's attributed to past service of your current members.
Service of your current members.
Yes.
And have we done anything like this combined aggregate method and normal cost method in any of the other plans?
Yes, they all have the entry age normal cost as a rate floor, just at a lower level. State Patrol, I believe, is at 70%, and the other plans are all at 80%.
Are we realizing the same smoothing that we're seeing for LEOFF? That we like, PERS seems to be popping pretty good to me.
Well, for PERS and TERS, of course, you've got the UAL piece that's separate.
For the plans
Yes, it's not because they're an entry age normal funding method or anything like that. It's just a separate unfunded liability for those closed plans. So that does cause, more volatility. The rate floor for the other plans is at a level because it's only 80%. So you take that entry age normal cost and then only take 80% of it as a rate floor. So in a lot of cases, the other plans are not at that rate floor. So they may be seeing some more volatility in their contribution rates because their aggregate contribution rate is higher than the rate floor. So they're not getting that same kind of smoothing.
Got it. Thank you.
Oh, Pat?
One of the confusions I see is when we go for a benefit improvement or something, and we're showing our aggregate method in funding, and then the legislature or other people that are arguing with it, bring up the projected unit credit method that shows a different cost, shows that we're overfunded.
I think
Am I off on that?
No, not really. I think what you're
That's what-
what you're getting at is the projected unit credit has been used to show the funded status of the plan, not a contribution rate, and that's
But they use that against us.
that is used for accounting purposes, not for funding the plan.
Right.
And I think what we're going to find is as we move into the new GASB requirements, GASB has completely separated funding and accounting for the plans, and so we're hopeful that might mitigate some of that comparison because they're very different. I mean, how you account for your plans versus how you pay for them are different. Yeah. But that's what they're after, because we've only used the projected unit credit for calculating the funded status because GASB does not allow aggregate because aggregate has no unfunded liability. So based on that, it's always 100% funded under that method. So it doesn't work for producing a funded status measure. We will be moving in our valuations very soon. I'm not sure if it'll be next year or the year after to just using the entry age method for funded status, no longer using projected unit credit.
So that issue that you raised will be addressed as soon as the reporting on the funded status and the valuation reports changes, which OSA is already planning to do in the near future.
Yes, GASB's new requirements are requiring the funded status now for accounting purposes to be under the entry age normal method.
Jeff, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I actually do have a question. You use the term intergenerational equity, and to translate that into something that we've had a topic of conversation about on the board previously, would that imply, or would it fit your definition to have homogenized benefits throughout the old system, starting from the point of origin, or would that address having differing benefits? Some of at the time that they're installed would be prospective as to funding for the people that would receive the benefits.
I'm not sure I'm completely following your question, Jeff. Are you asking about the contribution rates? So you've got members who started with one set of plan provisions, and then maybe the provisions have changed, and contribution rates then therefore change. And are you asking if that's impeding intergenerational equity?
Well, I'll step back again to define the difference between generation or intergenerational equity. Generational equity would be the generation that would receive the benefits would pay for those benefits, versus intergenerational appears to imply that you would have homogenized or similar benefits throughout the whole system and not have differing level of benefits. Am I following you at all?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm only familiar with how intergenerational equity has been defined in terms of funding for the benefits.
Yeah, that term that you're referring to is sort of a statutory term, and it only refers to funding rather than to the benefits themselves. So
let me approach
if
it
I'm
differently.
tracking, if you're talking about a benefit change, if the benefit change is prospective only, and then the rate increase is prospective only, and throughout the member's career you stay 100% funded in the plan with no surplus, then I think you're talking about both generational and intergenerational equity. What's happened in the past, what Lisa was talking about today with funded status, is you either build up a deficit today that future taxpayers have to pay off, or you overpay today and future taxpayers get a break. That's the way intergenerational equity can kind of come out in the funding of it. Where you're going with is the benefits piece, and that's correct. A question that comes up historically. Benefits have been handled. Benefit increases have been handled one of two ways. They're either prospective only, or they apply to all past service as well. And that's an area where intergenerational equity definitely comes into play, because now you have members who are getting additional benefit for their past service for which no contributions were made, and the current taxpayers and the current members are going to have to pay for that. And so another example of that, a very clear one, would be adding a retiree COLA. Retired members are getting a benefit, and it was never paid for during their career. When it's first added, it's now a new cost, and it's being paid for by current taxpayers and current members, if you will, but current participants in the plan, and it may apply to service that was rendered to the public 20 years ago or more.
That sets the foundation for the question, I guess, that would address the money aspect, the funding aspect here. If you talk about funding, if you have funding is at 100%, no surplus, we're plus or minus 113%, I believe, right now, at 100%. If prospectively you intend to fund a change in benefits here, that shouldn't start at 113% funding, a 13% discount, because those are contributions that have been made by past members. That is an accrued value that they'll receive no benefit for. It's exactly the inverse of intergenerational equity. They have paid for something they will not receive. So theoretically, if you start funding for something prospectively, that should be at 100% of the actual requirements of the system, it's 100% funded, and you go forward from there, that would be correct generational equity without actually capturing the 13%, say, for example, we have right now, just to pull a number out of the air, for a value that previous members, that including those that have retired, have contributed and will receive no benefit for. Therefore, when you talk, and I'm asking if I'm thinking right, trying to follow this. If you have benefits in front of you that you are about to pay for, a new benefit, say, for example, you're about to pay for, wouldn't that be also paid for past existing members, people that are drawing, by that surplus that they paid for at this point that they'll receive no value for otherwise? In other words, haven't they prepaid, or haven't they already paid for an increase in benefit proportionally? Are you following me? Sort of?
I'm not sure I'm completely following you, because you're mixing funded status of the plan with funding the plan. And the funded status of the plan can vary. It can be above or below 100%. And it's not exactly representing whether you've funded 100% or not. And it varies based on the aging of the plan. So when you have a very young plan, you would expect that funded status to be lower than 100%. And as the plan ages, it becomes closer to 100% and over. So I think there might be a couple measures being mixed in the discussion. But I think as far as a benefit, depending on what funding method you have. So if we go back to the aggregate funding method, where we take that piece of the pie, that this is the chunk that has to be contributed, any benefit improvement, whether it is for prospective, past service, anything, is going to get rolled into a normal cost and paid for by all current members and their employers. It's going to be developed into a normal cost rate and all get smoothed over the expected working lifetime of those current members. So those will be the people that will pay for the full impact of that benefit improvement.
Other questions? And now you are off the hook.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you. Moving on to item number 5. Paul Neal.
The assumed rate of return. We haven't got any actual costs from DRS yet. We kind of wanted to get some direction from the board before we asked them to start crunching numbers, but it would likely have administrative costs similar to what the DRS deferred compensation program is. We talked about that last month. That's about 1/10 of what the cost would be for a private administrator, roughly. Our preliminary research indicates this might be more restricted than a 457 plan. With a 457 plan, you can contribute whatever you want. You can change it. This looks like it might be more similar to the DC component that's in the current Plan 3s, which is basically you come in, you select a rate of contribution as a member, and that's the rate you have, and you can't change it unless you change employers. The Select Committee on Pension Policy is dealing with a similar issue right now. The Teachers Retirement System Plan 3, the law was written to say you can change it once a year. The IRS has come back and said, no, you can't, and we'll give you until 2014 to fix it. So presumably if you went down this plan, this is something we'd have to confirm with ICE Miller again, but if you went down this plan, it wouldn't have that flexibility. You'd have to come in, and when you started working, you'd decide how much you wanted, and we could offer a number of options, and then that's what it would be until you separated. Again, that would require legislation as well. Option number 3, basically this is again kind of falls in the category of leveraging existing infrastructure. You've got this 457 plan that does have all that flexibility. DRS administers it. It has a very low administrative fee. Some local governments have opted in and offer that to their employees. Some do not. So one possibility might be a shorter distance to point B, would be to have legislation that requires local government employers to at least make this available to their employees. One issue with that, there may be some existing contracts with their providers. You don't want to run afoul of the contracts clause. You don't want anything that's going to impair a contract. So that's just something we have to be aware of and look into. And this, again, would require legislation. So at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Kevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation. And I'm sorry I left last meeting early, and I don't think I heard your presentation. So just to confirm for me, like on option one, to do something like option one would be in addition to, because currently I believe a retiring left 2 member can buy credits, correct? And this would be in addition to that, but in a way similar, correct?
Yeah, mechanically it works a little different, but the end result is that you're taking money that you've saved elsewhere and then rolling it into and converting it into a defined benefit or an additional dollar amount added to your defined benefit. It would have the same characteristics. Would have, like, if you selected a survivor option, it would go with that. It would have the COLA that's built into Left Plan 2. The thing that this would have that would be a potential advantage is that the service credit purchase has a 5-year maximum. And we looked at last month, the average Left 2 retiree, if there is such a thing, that 5-year maximum would work out to about an $88,000 or $89,000 maximum they could do. So if somebody wanted to annuitize more than that, they would bump into that ceiling. So that's really what advantage this would provide.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Big one.
Paul, do we have any reason to think that there are jurisdictions out there that don't offer some sort of deferred savings, tax deferred savings?
Well, we haven't done a comprehensive check, but I think it's pretty safe to say that most or all jurisdictions do offer some kind of 457 or similar plan. They don't necessarily do it through the state, and so they might have higher administrative costs with it. But I think most local governments do have some kind of plan that they can.
But don't they all currently have an option to invest with the state if they choose to?
They do. That's correct.
So what would be the point of the third one if everybody's already got a 457 available to them and presumably each local jurisdiction's done their homework to figure out what's the best deal for their employees, and they could always go to the state if they wanted to? What would be the problem we're solving with number 3?
Well, that's a good question. I think that if it's a problem, and I'm not sure that it is, it'd be the difference between the blue bar and the red bar.
But in the I'm talking.
Because the blue bar is if you have because basically what we looked at last month is that if you've got a private administrator other than
I'm
the
not
state,
talking about for an annuity.
Oh, well,
I'm talking about to get to to save up money so you can dump it in and get an annuity.
Right, and that's the difference between the blue bar and the red bar, which is that in the blue bar you've got a private administrator with a fee of roughly 0.13%. Whereas in the red bar, you've got the state administrator with roughly 0.013.
Yeah, what Paul is, it's your second assumption, the presumption that all of the locals have done their homework and picked the best plan available. What the research is showing is that the product provided by the state, both because of the assumptions that are used, because it's invested by the State Investment Board, because it's administered by DRS, it's much more efficient, doesn't have the profit motive. And so as a product, all marketing aside, the state 457 plan is superior from a return point of view for members, but it's not available out there to all local jurisdictions. It's available as an option. They just haven't chosen it.
Okay, I don't want to belabor because I would hate to take up everybody else's time on something I don't fully understand, but I don't think we're talking about the same thing here. For you to get into any kind of annuity, if you don't start out from day one saying, I want to start plunking money into an annuity, so you just have a 457 to save money. It's a big savings account that goes to the stock market, right?
Yes.
And nobody out there in county land or city land that I know of is pumping programs for their people to earn 4% a year. They're getting their 457s are returning what the market's returning, just like the state's 457 plans are.
Yes.
The states might be better, and they have the option to go to the state, but they're not the difference between 4% and 12%.
Not in the returns. It's more where
Okay, so step
is the
one.
fees.
Step one is you save your money.
Yes.
Step two is you go buy an annuity from somebody.
Yes.
Let's take blue and red off the chart. That's a bad idea. We can take our savings and we can go purchase something from the state, and that's a good idea. And I've always been a fan of that. What I don't understand is what do we add by forcing people to do that step one through the state, whereas they can already do it now if they choose to, and they have other plans that they also choose to do it through. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying, what do we solve?
Right. You're getting the additional efficiency, and that additional efficiency piece, Paul talked about in more detail in his last presentation, and you don't quite see it in this slide because this slide has two pieces to it. You've got the efficiency and then in the annuity purchase based on that efficiency. The efficiency being the lower fees. So theoretically, if you're invested in the state program for 20 years versus the private 457 plan for 20 years, even though you make the same contributions, you're going to have a bigger pot of money at the end, and you'll be able to buy her a better annuity, a bigger annuity with it. Not just because of the difference in assumptions, but because you've also going to have more cash.
But they already have that option.
Yes. So this would be sort of forcing them to take the state option.
I'm not even sure we change anything because I think all we said in there is that we would make it an option for them, that it has to be an option for everybody,
Right.
but still an option.
That's right.
And it's already an option for everybody. So I have a really simple question. What do we change?
It's an option for all employers. It's not an option for all employees. All employers can opt into it, but not all have.
Employers that have probably signed exclusive contracts with private for-profit.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I didn't understand. So there are employers out there who've made probably unwise enough choices that they've precluded themselves from getting into the state plan, and they have maybe not the best plans on their own.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I needed to know.
You're good.
Not anybody that I work for does. So, okay.
Yeah, we haven't identified anyone.
I'm guessing, yeah, if Kitsap County doesn't have the state 457 plan as an option, they soon will, I'm guessing.
Any other questions for Paul? I'd like to see us move ahead with some follow-up on it.
That'd be fine. That would require a motion. So, in terms of some direction from you guys about what you want to pursue.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, after listening to all three of these, number two is still sort of in limbo. I feel comfortable with number one and number three, and move forward with both of those.
Okay.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, if you would cast your vote. And the motion passes. Moving on to number 7, the administrative update. Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Paul. I'm sorry. Good job.
The Select Committee on Pension Policy met last week. The committee in executive action and at the full committee, they heard an update from the state actuary regarding the economic experience report results that were presented to you, the summary of the results that were presented to you in the report, the written report. The committee did not take any action to move forward on any of the topics that were presented to them by the LEOFF 2 board. I will be speaking to the select committee at their September meeting again about the activities of the board, and so that would be another opportunity for them to choose or to coordinate on any LEOFF 2 board topics. But at this point in time, they're not moving forward on any of the same issues. Outreach activities. In addition to the Pension Funding Council meeting, I've been continuing to meet with board members regarding your expectations for the board, for the team here, and those will be concluded before the October meeting. I will have had a chance to meet and discuss expectations with all of you, and we'll have a summary of those results and follow up on your expectations at the October offsite. Ryan and I wrote an article for The Guardian, which is a publication, I believe, of the Seattle Police Officers Guild, that regarding retirement planning. The upcoming month, WACOPS will be having their conference, and I will be attending that and speaking to the board's interim activities. And we'll have some kind of a handout summarizing what work you've been doing this interim, and that handout will be provided to all of you as well. Also, prior to the October meeting, I've been invited to speak at the International Employee Benefits Foundation's Trustee Master Program regarding public sector plans. And so I'll be making that presentation in October, and that will also be before our next meeting. That is what we have on outreach activities. October meeting, I'd like to remind all of you, is going to be an off-site. We've got the location, and that information has been sent out to all of you. Will be the format of this October meeting will be similar to the meeting from last year. As you'll recall, we'll talk about your expectations. In particular, we're going to drill down into some of the areas where you expressed a desire to have additional dialogue. It'll be more of an informal setting, group setting. We'll be breaking you guys up into some smaller teams to work on some of it and so forth. But that will be the format and the type of materials, so that there's not going to be any formal board action. There's not going to be motions. There's not going to be presentations like a typical board meeting. This will be similar to what your meeting from last October focused on your expectations of us, and a chance for you also to all get to know each other better. With that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my administrative update.
Steve, I have a question.
Yes.
Under the outreach activities, are you still planning on sending someone to the Washington State Fire Commissioners Conference in October?
Yes. Thank you for reminding me of that, Paul. Yes, we will. The LEOFF 2 board has been invited to set up at the Fire Commissioners Conference for the last couple of years since you joined the board. Thank you for that. And we were invited again this year, and we will attend. I will not be able to make it this year, but we're going to have at least 2 members from our team there. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions of Steve? Agenda item number 8. Dawn, looks like you're excited to get started here. So,
we haven't taken a break, but this is in 3 parts, so we could break it up if lunch arrives or whatever. So I'm Dawn Cortez, and I am the Assistant Attorney General who is assigned to represent the LEOFF 2 board. And so the first part of my presentation is, why does the board have an AAG? Well, the role of the Attorney General is set out in RCW 4310-030. I'm not going to go through all of these in a lot of detail. I prepared this so that you would have it and you could use it and look at it in the future. And so there's a lot of detail in here. Basically, you have an Attorney General, an Assistant Attorney General assigned to you because the Attorney General represents all state agencies in all legal matters. That's the bottom line here. And not only does the Attorney General represent agencies, but it also represents boards, specifically in 4310-040. And so we represent you in all things. I come to these meetings because I can't stress how important it is that I know your business if I'm going to be able to give you relevant legal advice. We do have some clients who just like to call periodically and get look at a contract here or there or get a legal decision on something. But when I know the underlying business, I really can understand where you're trying to get to. I can come up with other options, much more helpful. Also, board meetings, of course, are controlled by the Open Public Meetings Act, and so one of my duties is to sit here and make sure that we stay on track with that. So what is the impact of consulting with non-AG attorneys? Because there are quite a few out there, and in the next slide we'll talk about a few that you have. One, if you consult with other attorneys who are not one of the assistant attorney generals who are legally your counsel, then the attorney-client privilege doesn't exist. And so if you have emails, you get advice, you get a letter or something from another attorney, it would not be protected in a public records request, and whatever you say to that attorney or whatever that attorney says to you would not be privileged in a deposition or in testimony. You'd actually have to say, I told them this, and they would have to testify that they told you that. That's one of the problems. Two, it's not an official legal opinion, and so you might be operating off of it, and then a lawsuit comes along and you find out that your AG says, well, that's not how we view it, and that's not a position we will be able to take in court. So there are a variety of views about how things work. Many of you have either county attorneys or city attorneys or other people like that who represent you in another capacity in which you might be tempted to get those sorts of legal opinions. But it is the legal opinion of the AG in consultation with how you view that should be taken that would be presented in court and in your legal briefing and other things. The other thing about my position is that it's a very objective position for you. I don't actually work for you. You don't set my pay. You don't hire me, fire me, that sort of thing. And so it's a very objective opinion, and our office takes that very seriously, that we be able to give you what we believe is really the correct answer for any situation. What you do with it, I don't advise you on policy, and I don't make policy decisions for you. And so what you do with it is your choice, but we just try to give you the legal information behind it. And finally, we have, I don't know if we still do, we did have over 500 other assistant attorney generals around the state. We haven't filled quite a few positions, so it may be fewer than that. But literally on a regular basis, I go to other AGs in my division and say, here's the situation I'm looking at. They come up with all kinds of other solutions, things that have happened with other agencies. It's incredibly helpful. Some of the non-AAGs in your life, well, first of all, you probably know that Steve is an inactive attorney. He's educated as a lawyer. You have a staff member who is a licensed attorney. You also have a board member who is a licensed and I think still practicing attorney. You also have, as I mentioned before, cities and counties. A legislature has an attorney. There are unions and associations, guilds. They have their own attorneys. Friends and families may be attorneys. All these other people may be giving you input, but their advice is not the legal advice for the board, and they can't represent you. Okay, so the next topic is ethics, everybody's very favorite topic. I know that you all have received ethics training before, and that you may have or probably do have ethics laws and rules at the cities and the counties. You also have policies in your individual agencies. And so it's important to remember that when you are a board member, it is the state ethics laws that apply to you. So I will address use of the plan resources, the gifts, meals, and travel expenses, use of the board's confidential information, campaign contributions, and open public meetings will be a separate piece at the end. The basic fundamental principles, of course, is that when serving as a board member, you are required to act solely in the interest of the plan membership and the trust funds, and not in your own individual interest or the interest of the people that you work with. So you may not use your position to gain gifts, rewards, special benefits. That seems really obvious, but then when you get into the individual situations, it's not always as obvious as it seems. So this is just a general slide, so you have this for the future. Where do all the state rules come from? They're listed out here, and you can turn to this slide if you need to. One of the things I wanted to say was that ethics are not, they do not equate to a moral decision about something. Frequently, people think they don't need to know what the ethics rules are because they're just a really good person and they're going to just do the right thing. Ethics rules actually were designed to put rules out there when there are often two conflicting right things to do. And they set the rules for what you can and can't do. So, for instance, you may be deciding whether you can take something or not accept something because you would say, well, this is not going to influence my decision on something, so that's okay. Or there might be a very specific rule that says because you have some kind of contract with that person, you absolutely can't take that no matter what. And so you always want to look back to the specific rules when you're making decisions and not necessarily just do the gut check and say, well, I think this is okay, or it's okay under, my local policy. So for the use of trust funds, this is really the use of what we normally would call state resources or office resources. The various things that we're looking at here are office space, the staff time, the computers, the new iPads that have been handed out to you, any cell phones. I don't think you have cell phones as board members, but if you did. Also, the data and any intellectual property that is created here, all is part of the trust resources. So while you can have Jessica set up some travel for you to come over here for this meeting, you obviously couldn't ask Jessica to then set up some travel for after the meeting where you're going to go somewhere else and do something else. These iPads are new and they deserve a little talk. These are resources of the trust. If you put personal information on these iPods, it is at some point possible that a court would order it to be turned over and to be reviewed, particularly if there was a public records request. You cannot, in the next category, you cannot use that iPad, I think I've been calling it a pod, the iPad to run a business, to run your other state business or local county business that you have. You obviously can't use it for lobbying or campaign purposes or anything that's illegal. If you store personal email on it, or if you mix personal email, there are cases where the court has ordered that people's personal email be turned over when they have refused essentially to turn over things that may be public records. So this is one discussion we were having earlier where you all do not have left to email accounts and you are receiving information maybe into personal accounts. You might want to think about whether or not that's a good way to do it. If it's in a LEOFF account, then that would be the only place anybody would really be looking for public records that relate to a public records request that came in to the LEOFF 2 board. If you store it in other areas, you open up those other email accounts to potential searches. So that's one thing to think about that's been coming up. This came up because Kelly and I exchanged some emails, and when I related to the SIB, I also represent the SIB, and Kelly's on that board now. And I sent him something that was confidential to the SIB, and I thought about whether really we should have some other kinds of accounts. I leave that up to you to decide. De minimis use of resources is often permitted. You need to look at the specific policy on that. De minimis is not a lot. There's been a discussion about whether looking at the news daily, if it doesn't relate specifically to your job, is actually a de minimis use. There's mixed views on that. Basically, the one thing is how much it costs the state to do it. So, for instance, I don't have any problem receiving telephone calls from long distance where I'm not paying anything for it, but I'm not to make a long distance phone call in my office at work if it will cost the state some money. So the most commonly reported resource misuse cases, we got this from the State Ethics Board, is employee use of agency technology resources for outside business. We constantly catch people doing business on state resources. Other things like visiting pornographic sites, travel, shopping sites, sending inappropriate stuff. I mean, their office is rife with these kinds of complaints. Other sorts of personal outside business use of state cars or car repair facilities, you all don't have that sort of thing. Yours is more the equipment. Using state credit cards, which I also don't think are issued to this board, so that's not an issue. Promotion of campaigns via state email or on state time or in state facilities, and actually out-and-out theft. So some of the very specific prohibitions, okay, there are some prohibitions that apply to specific activities. One is the receipt of gifts, disclosure of confidential information. It's actually an ethics violation if you disclose confidential information that belongs to the board when you don't have authority from the rest of the board to do so. It's also an ethics violation if you conceal information. So when there's a public records request and you're requested for whatever records you have and you don't turn some over either through negligence or because you just don't want it out there, if that is revealed, then you can also face an ethics violation, which would then mean personal penalties against you. So it's not just the agency that has a penalty for not disclosing things. We've already talked about use of state resources for private gain or benefit. Can't use any state resources for political campaigns, financial interests and transactions involving the state. So that means that if your wife owns a copier company and the board is looking to buy a copier or even rent a copier, you would be financially gaining because you're married to that person if you voted on a board vote to enter into a contract with that company. That's the sort of thing. It also applies to friends and family members. There are prohibitions on outside financial interests, including compensation from outside activities, using any of this for that sort of thing. Honoraria is when you speak to a group and you receive money for that. It is possible to do that, but you basically cannot be on state time. You can't be using state resources, and you can't use anything that you've actually prepared on state time. So say Steve is going to go off and speak to a group, and he's going to be paid to do that, and he takes leave, and maybe the other group flies him out there where he doesn't, he pays for it himself. He also wouldn't be able to use a presentation that he had prepared on state time, on state resources, or for this board. He'd need to do his own. And Melanie De Leon, the director for the Executive Ethics Board, has talked about this. She does speak to and is paid to speak to, say, law schools. And so she will actually prepare a separate presentation, not the one that she goes around agencies using, but she will prepare a separate presentation on her own time, on her own computer, so that she doesn't violate this. The employment of former employees, I think you guys are well aware of the various statutes and issues that are going on with that. This has to do with letting them go, agreements that you're going to bring them back, that kind of thing. And assisting persons in transactions involving the state, that's giving people a special in that nobody else would have. So your son, your brother-in-law, you introduce them to Steve so that Steve will know them when a contract is coming up or a position is coming up. That. All right, turning to gifts. Basically, if you want it, you probably can't have it. You can't seek or accept anything of economic value that could reasonably be expected to influence or reward your performance, the performance of your duties. Gifts generally cannot accept a gift from any particular source in a value excess of $50 a year. I know when I worked for Spokane County, they didn't have this kind of $50 rule, and the rule in Spokane County was you couldn't accept anything, period. And so, but at the state level, you can accept things. In a minute, we're going to talk about when you can't accept anything. Does not include items related to outside businesses that are customary and not related to official duties. What does that mean? That means that the Starbucks comes around the whole neighborhood and gives out $5 off coupons or something, or free coffee. If they're giving it to everybody and it's just a standard customary thing, then you can take that. You can't take it because they're giving them to Left 2 board members. Obviously, you can accept things from friends and family or items that are donated. Okay, here's where my slides got a little mixed up. So there are different, and there are some restrictions when an employee is involved in regulation or acquiring goods and services. Now, this really doesn't impact you too much, but you do have some contractors. One is this Davis Accounting Tax Audit Services. When you guys got this new iPad system, there was a contractor involved. On the outside site last year, you hired a, what did we call him? The guy who presented to me.
The facilitator.
The facilitator, that sort of thing. When you enter into contracts and you have that kind of relationship with somebody, then there are very special rules that come into play. And even though the staff is doing those contracts, you are the board members in charge of them, and some of these you actually have to approve. And so despite the fact that somebody else might be signing the contract, Steve, or entering into it, you all can be also on the hook for these. So, for some reason, Melanie De Leon doesn't even know why flowers are just out. I assume there must have been some circumstance where somebody was influenced by a lot of flowers, but you can't accept them. Gifts from dignitaries and food and beverages are just not okay under Section 4. Melanie De Leon gives a really detailed, ridiculous exception on purpose. She talks about somebody being in a deposition and hiring a court reporter, and the court reporter comes. And so it's the state, in this instance, hiring the court reporter. The court reporter brings cookies, and she offers them to everybody. Can you take the cookie? Well, the answer is no, unless you pay for it. You can always pay for it, and then you can accept it. And this actually happened to me recently where an attorney, we were on the same side, was paying for lunch for everyone, but that attorney was a special assistant attorney general, had a contract with the attorney general's office. He was buying lunch for everybody, and I said, nope, here's my $10. I'll pay for my own lunch. I had lunch, but didn't pay for it. And you also, from these contractors, you cannot take expenses for travel, room, meals, even for a speech or seminar, even if it's reasonable, which you would be able to do if you didn't have a contract with them, but you cannot when you do have a contract. Let's see. Where's the back button? Oops, here we go. He's got. Okay, so some things that you can accept even if you are what we call a Section 4 employee, which is a person who has the special relationship, is that you can accept some things which are advertising or promotional items. We think of these as, we used to say, nobody gets these anymore, mouse pads, key chains, junk that they just give out. You can accept plaques and awards for appreciation. Samples, I don't know that you guys really receive much of that, but people like DES who purchase large items would be getting samples of things. Publications relating to official duties. Food and beverages at hosted receptions. This is one area where it's different, where you can go to a reception, say they have a reception for everybody, they want to show you all of their services that might be available. This is the thing you've heard talked about where you can stand at the table if you don't sit down and it's not a meal and you can just get the hors d'oeuvres and that sort of thing. It's very, very limited. You can also take exception to charitable events. And here's another list of things that I don't think necessarily apply to all of you, but it's in here. All right. Meals and travel specifically, for all board members, you already know this, I know, but we do have some new board members, I guess. Employee and officer travel is governed by the OFM rules in the state's SAM. It's the, call it the SAM manual, but the M is manual, so it's redundant. Travel and meeting attendance should normally be approved in advance. Obviously, all of these meetings that you come to are assumed to be approved in advance, but if you're going to attend other meetings than that, you would want to clear that with your board staff. Check with Jessica about any questions that you have about meals and travel. As you know, she helps you set things up and she works through these issues. Any request should identify any anticipated entertainment in advance. I don't think that you run into this as much as some others do, but and the only place I could think of that you might run into this is when you are attending a training, and sometimes state trainings don't do this, but outside private trainers will sometimes have a piece of a training. It'll cost $1,500 to attend a training, and some piece of it is a big piece of entertainment. That is not allowed under the state rules. So you would want to either work that out that you're not going to pay for that piece, you're not going to attend it, or you're going to pay personally for that piece. Could be anything. It's usually, frankly, singers, and I mean, some of these are. Well, the state investment board goes to things where one of them, Billy Joel, came and sang, and so basically the investment officers said, okay, well the meeting part's done. I'm leaving, and they don't participate in that piece of it. Let's see here. All right, the board's confidential information, I think we've already covered this. This is just a little bit more specific. Campaign contributions, reported contributions are not gifts. If there's a quid pro quo involved, a contribution from a contractor should be considered as compensation, gratuity, or reward from an entity interested in state business. If you have specific questions about campaign contributions and how they may or may not affect you as a state member, you can get a hold of Steve or you can get a hold of me and we can talk about that in more detail. Melanie De Leon is readily accessible to anybody with questions. Sometimes you want me to ask them because then I don't tell her who's asking and I can ask for you, and you have a little cover there. So, recusal from board, staff, action, deliberations, discussions. If you think that you have an interest, then that's the way. One of the ways to resolve it is to simply recuse yourself. Okay, but by my position here as a Left 2 board member, the fact that I'm a firefighter, I'm a law enforcement, I'm with the county, my position requires that I have an interest in the plan. How is that different? You're making decisions every day that might benefit you specifically. Well, RCW 4226-715 acknowledges and requires that the left plan board members consist of members who have an interest in the plan. Therefore, it is through the legislature, it's okay that you can make decisions, even though it might increase your own retirement or benefit. I don't know how these got out of order, but they are a little out of order. Excess compensation was actually an example of This is an example of how you have to consider the benefits of the whole plan, however, and not just your own individual group and or your own personal view of something. I was thinking of this when excess compensation came up. The board may be asked at some point to take a position on any legislative proposal. This was just an example that's been in front of you a lot, where the impact on members who may be you'll have to consider the impact on members who may be denied opportunities for overtime. You're going to have to consider the impact on the fund of providing additional retirement compensation should the legislature go that direction, and the potential impact on employers who may be charged additional retirement payments incurred by granting excess compensation. So even though you might be here on behalf or been put on this board because of a particular group, firefighters, law enforcement, employers, you as a board member have to consider all of the interests for everybody in the plan when you make your decision. Okay, so how do ethics violations come to light? I found this interesting when I attended my own training, and it's really good to remember. The number one way that these violations come out to the ethics board is through staff or coworker or a subordinate. That is far and away the way they find out most things. Secondarily, through an auditor's office audit, employee performance investigations. When somebody's complaining about one thing, then ethics violations also come out. They're uncovered during the course of other investigations, as you guys are probably well aware, and reports by the public or the media. So whatever you're doing, other people generally know about it, and they frequently file with the ethics board, who then conducts an investigation. What happens if you are found to have violated the ethics law? Well, one, you can personally, first of all, there are damages that are suffered by the state because of it, but you can personally face civil penalties of up to $5,000 per violation, or 3 times the value of whatever you received. You also may be barred from or limited in doing business with the board, so, the governor may, or whoever your group is, may remove you. You may be subject to official reprimand by the board. You can be removed, as that is your position. A contract may be rescinded because of the violation, and you may be subject to action by a citizen or by the Attorney General. When you are accused of an ethics violation, I can't represent you. The Attorney General's office can't represent you. It's a personal thing against you. You have to hire your own attorney. You can certainly always ask us ethics questions in advance, and the board can come and ask ethics questions when a board member has been accused, but we are not able to provide individual advice and or assistance when there's a violation. Are there questions about that? Not that in particular, but the whole, anything in the ethics arena. Do you want to go on to open public meetings? I think I only have a few.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, so open public meetings law is set out in RCW 4230. As you all know, by statute, all board meetings are to be open to the public with official notice provided in advance. You guys are very good about that. I've observed that. So what's really more important is when a meeting occurs. You all do seem to be aware of this too, but it's always good to remember, and especially when you have new board members. A meeting occurs whenever 6 board members get together to transact business. You don't have to have the transacting business in your mind before this kicks in. So if you all go to a bar and you start having a couple of beers and then you start talking about something on the agenda, a board meeting has started if there are 6 of you, and that could be in violation of the law. So it's anytime you're receiving public testimony, any deliberations that you have, reviews, evaluations, considerations, and discussions. So when you go into executive session, when you're allowed to go into executive session and have deliberations on an issue, if you turn to any other issue that's not, where you're not allowed to have deliberations and you just start discussing it, you're having a closed meeting when you're supposed to be having a public meeting. One case came up where board members were talking to each other via email, and there were at least a quorum in these email exchanges, and it was deemed to be a meeting that was closed. So you have to be careful when you're doing that. You can speak to 1-to-1 or less than a quorum, but if you get a quorum going, you have a meeting. Another situation happened, which is similar to the bar that I talked about, where people were riding in a car to a meeting, and there was a quorum, and they because some boards are only 3 members, and so that was a violation. The other place it comes up, you guys had a talk about having everybody able to come to one of your administrative meetings, and that's fine. You can have people there at the administrative or any other committee meeting. But if you have a quorum and people have a discussion at that point, once again, you have an open meeting. You're supposed to have an open meeting. When may the board go into executive session? It's very, very limited. It's when you're talking about public contract negotiations, candidate or employee evaluations, which is really where I've mostly seen you do it here. Litigation on legal matters, you can take your lawyer in and we can sit down and talk about it if you have a case pending against you or you're thinking about bringing a case. and valuable financial or commercial information related to an investment, which you probably don't have. Here are additional resources, and if you have any questions or in the future you have any, you can call me, you can go through Steve, however you want to do that. I'm done.
Questions for Dawn? Great reminder, great update.
Thank you.
Mr. Nelson looked like he'd like to have something to eat, so you can tell by the look on his face. Let's take 15 minutes, try to start back at noon so we can finish up. Okay, if everybody's ready, we'll get started again. Agenda item number 9.
Mr. Chair, by way of introduction, as you'll recall, at your past meeting, you had a presentation from Paul on the topic of career change, introducing you to some of the issues that have been raised in the media in particular surrounding some recent hirings of chiefs into PERS jobs or hiring of chiefs as independent contractors, and how that kind of hiring practice fit or didn't fit into the career change legislation that was recommended and proposed by the LEOFF 2 board in the past and passed by the legislature. So Paul today is following up on that, and with that I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. For the record, again, my name is Paul Neal, Senior Legal Counsel for the board. Not an AG, so anything we talk about is not attorney-client privileged, as very correctly pointed out. The issue that was framed for this presentation from last time and again today is that abuse of that career change legislation. It really brings up this public trust issue that we talked about last time, that the plans are responsibly designed and professionally managed. The background is, as Steve went into, recent action by City of DuPont redesignating a police chief position as part-time so that a Left Plan 2 member could, or Left Plan 2 retiree rather, could fill that position and continue to draw his pension. That was not the intended consequence of the 2005 career change legislation, and one could argue that it undermines the legitimate policy of that law. One thing that we didn't have last time that I wanted to backfill in a little bit for the board is actual data about what is actually going out there with the career change law. We did get some information from DRS, who was very helpful in running a report for us to kind of look and see who's doing this and what are they doing. Since the 2005 law came into effect, we've had 263 Left Plan 2 retirees who've benefited from it. Their average annual compensation, and again, it varies quite a bit, but the average came up with was about $28,000. So these are not people that are roughly, you could say they're mostly not working full time. More than 61% of the people who've come back do not work for Left employers. So there's ability to come back into a Left job, and the majority of them don't come back to places where that could even happen. And of the people that are coming back to Left employers, one employer that does this a fair amount is King County. And of course, that's a huge county. So the fact that you retire from, say, the King County Sheriffs and then come back to work in King County, that doesn't mean you're coming back as a law enforcement officer. There's a lot of jobs at King County. This is just a quick pie chart to kind of show where the people who are Left 2 retirees coming back to work, where they're coming to. A lot of them go to work for school districts, what I assume would be maybe security officers for a school district, something like that. State agencies is a lot of them. There's a little bit of overlap with the state agencies. There are 8 of these folks that came back to work for the University of Washington, which is a state agency, but is also in a limited capacity a Left employer, although that's not clearly the majority of their mission or their employee base. Again, you got a big chunk going back to cities or counties. That, again, doesn't necessarily mean they're coming back to Left positions. And I should say that the data we got from DRS doesn't track what position they're actually going into, because they don't track that data, as we've talked about in other things. So the fact that someone retired from a city and went back to work for a county, you wouldn't want to conclude from that they're coming back into a Left position.
Paul, does this include personal service contracts?
No, this is just employees. So these are people that are being reported to DRS. So we're getting from
a separate.
Right, that's a separate issue. And just parenthetically with that, DRS is really stepping up their review of personal service contract issues. They've sent out a notice to employers saying, tell us who these people are and let's see the contracts so we can see if these are legitimate. So they're following up on that. I think a lot of that in the wake of the Associated Press articles that revealed some issues with that. So looking at this, there are some options to go forward. The first option is to go back to the original career change law, clarify that reemployment in a law enforcement officer or firefighter job requires suspension of pension even if it's less than full-time fully compensated. And remember that the issue is that the LEOFF membership requirements are that you be full-time fully compensated, so we've had some questions about, well, what if I didn't get health insurance? Would I then not be fully compensated so I could come back? Or what if I were 35 hours a week and so technically part-time? So you could have a bill that really went back to the original intent of the law and clarified that if you're working in what would normally be a law enforcement or firefighter job, it's still not going to qualify for the career change law. That would require remedial legislation, and I think it would be important to specify that we're remedial legislation to avoid any kind of issue around someone claiming, well, I had a right under the old law to do this, and now you're taking that away. There's a pretty good case law that talks about that. If you don't have a Bockenhouse right to an unintended consequence, basically. Option 2 is to take no action. You don't really have to do anything. That allows the current situation to continue. That is a slight expansion of the original career change policy. No legislation is required there. I think the issue with this is that you're kind of saying it's okay with us, but to take advantage of this, you have to kind of work the system a little bit, because to have this work now, you've got to come in and take what normally would be a law enforcement officer or firefighter position and work with the definition a little bit to take it out of its usual spot. The third option would be just to say we think this is okay, and to amend the law to say you can do this, and you don't have to manipulate the job description. Basically say that if you come back to work as a LEOFF retiree, regardless of whether it's a PERS or a LEOFF job, you can elect to continue to receive your pension and not re-enter membership. That would be a pretty big change to the original policy. There's a potential there, as we talked about at the last meeting, for unfavorable public reaction. There's ways to work with that. I think you could put some conditions on what kind of positions you could extend it to. You wouldn't have to kick the door fully open. We could, bring back some different options for maybe some conditions. So those are the three options. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Question for Paul? Questions for Steve? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Kevin.
I was deciding if I had a question or not. I think I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So isn't there potentially a fourth option? Because I guess option 1 says that that if you take a job, your pension is suspended. Wouldn't there be a fourth option where if you took a job where you're more or less helping out as a school security officer or a bus driver or something, where you make under a certain amount of money, then you could still collect both, but if it was over a threshold or an amount of money, then your pension would be suspended?
You could do that, although people in the examples you mentioned wouldn't have an issue, because it wouldn't change the current law where if you came back to work in what was normally a PERS job, like a school security officer or something like that, then under the current law, you would be able to take that option and continue to receive your pension and not enter PERS. So what this option really talks about...
that's only for left classified jobs.
This is really talking about, I'm a retired LEOFF 2 member. I come back to work as what would normally be a law enforcement position, but they made me part-time, and so therefore that's really what this is about.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the questions was Bockenhuis that I was going to ask. That you kind of begged the question with the first one. The second one has to do with the number of people that you cite here. I would probably be an application of the state employee, although the options I would have would be to defer my distributions from my LEOFF retirement and to join as a dual member as part of the PERS system, PERS 2 system, as a state employee. The other option I had was to opt out of the retirement system. Does this account for all the people that have opted out of the retirement systems, or is this taking consideration everybody in every capacity in a state job?
I believe the answer to that is it takes account for everybody, because I know DRS has a policy where if you're an employer and you hire somebody who's a retiree, you're supposed to report that fact to DRS regardless of the capacity which that employee's hired. Now, that's not to say that everybody does that.
Right.
But that's the data they would have. Because a lot of the folks, like I say, the average compensation was $28,000, so there are a lot of folks making less than that. So, if someone's making $8,000, they're probably not going to be in a PERS eligible position.
And a follow-up question is, I'm going to take a Glenn Olson tack on this, but what is the problem we're trying to solve?
It's really the public trust issue. When we had the issue came up with the DuPont hire, it was in the paper. There was a big issue as a result of that. The Olympian had an editorial saying, this is part of this whole retire rehire thing. We need to get rid of the whole thing. So the policy issue, it's really this dynamic with the public trust versus other policy issues.
On your first question, I think the only people that are allowed to opt out of the retirement system are elected officials, and that's why you were allowed to opt out, I believe.
That's true.
Well, there's a couple of things working on at play, and there have been, well before the career change legislation that the board proposed, there were different rules regarding how elected officials are reported when they move from one public job into another, oftentimes at the same time. We've got elected officials who are active law enforcement officers, not just retired law enforcement officers. So those rules, I don't want to get those confused with career change. Specifically for career change, the option that was created by the board with your prior bill dealt with people moving into PERS positions and giving them the choice of either continuing to receive their pension while they're employed, or to suspend their pension and earn a second pension in PERS. As you know, the retirement age for Left Plan 2, 50, 53. By that time, you don't have the ability to earn the 60% of your salary that's generally considered the minimum threshold that you want to have in retirement. So, but under prior law, if you were a Left 2 retiree, you were statutorily precluded from earning an additional pension in another plan. So the career change created this new opportunity for members who were retiring early out of left careers and yet either weren't ready to stop working, hadn't earned enough overall pension to retire at that earlier age, but they couldn't continue in a police or fire career. Now what Paul has pointed out is DuPont is sort of this example of, well, we're not really changing careers. Now we're promoting within the same career. Nobody would consider a police chief to be a different career from law enforcement. It's more a promotion in that existing career path. And now the question is, what do you as a board, how do you kind of want to handle this new dynamic, especially since they're using the original board legislation as the vehicle to sort of accomplish this. In the past, prior to the board's career change legislation, you couldn't have a person go to work part-time in PERS and receive their Left 2 pension. So now the idea that a person could go to work as a chief for 35 hours a week and get their pension and their chief's salary, that's a consequence of the legislation that the board passed, an unintended consequence of the legislation that the board passed. You've got this reaction now, both from the legislature last session and from the media in the interim, in terms of how the reaction to that. Paul mentioned the editorial by the Daily Olympian saying you need to repeal, get rid of this ability altogether. You had the legislation recommended in the Senate last year to, limit the amount of overtime that you guys could work. But that was in response to actually the exact same, there were earlier newspaper articles coming out of DuPont. This and today's presentation was to give you some of this additional information that we've got from DRS, and also then to get some direction from you in terms of what options do you want us to continue to pursue and bring back to you for further discussion. So that's kind of what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, just another piece of this, and this is not taking a position either for or against at this point, but to explain some of my personal experiences. There's a number of sergeants and lieutenants in larger agencies out there that get 20, 25 years on, and in consideration of the dynamics or the stress or the pressures of a larger agency, would look for a chief's job in a small location, a burg, this kind of a thing. The problem is usually the money is about a third of the money that they'd, even as a chief, that they'd receive as a lieutenant in a larger police department. To allow themselves to be able to transition in, they can't afford the 2/3 cut in cash flow. So by nature of what we've done, it was completely prohibited before, but in order to be able to serve some of the smaller agencies and provide them with a level of experience and ability that comes from having the skill set you'd acquire as a sergeant, lieutenant, captain in a larger agency, they're forced to do exactly what has brought the public outcry as foul by redefining the positions or attempting to make it a part-time or contract position, completely removing it from our purview in order to be able to accomplish, to gain access to the level of experience that they would need to well-run a local department. So I'm trying to look at, is there any way we could possibly not do the kind of damage that will result simply from a public outcry and find a balance here someplace to accommodate the needs of the smaller departments while at the same time some of the peripheral abuses we are seeing to limit them.
No, in my opinion, no. I think for instance, the public outcry that you talked about, the completely justifiable issues that you raised, those are exactly the same kind of issues that DuPont's raising, saying we want to hire the best qualified people, and we can't do it if they have to give up their pension in order to come and work for us. It would force us to hire people from other states where they could get their pension from another state and come to work as a chief here and get both salary and. But again, right now, the public opinion of hiring retired public employees into that same kind of job or similar type of job is so disfavored that I don't think there is any kind of lower, watered down, or medium type option that will work. I'm basing this on the experience of the retire-rehire legislation that's gone on in the other plans, where it's been completely eliminated. The idea that you can retire and go back to work kind of in your same job, no. I think what we found when the career change bill was passed, there was a different attitude towards, say, a law enforcement officer retiring and then going to work for a county and courtroom security, or going to work for the school district as security, or going to work for the AG's office as an investigator. There didn't seem to be that same sort of disfavor, but when you're talking about what is clearly sort of the same career path, the reaction has been very different in terms of the public, and in particular, it's the salaries. You know, if there may be for instance, one way to moderate it might be to limit total compensation that you could get. I know in the case of DuPont, for instance, that was a big part of it, is the chief salaries, even part-time chief salaries, are, I don't know if you'd consider DuPont a small jurisdiction or not, but they did point out that the fire chief that they hired had a pension of over $100,000 and that had a salary of well over $100,000 as well, even part-time. And similar with the police chief that's currently being hired. And so when the public was like, total compensation is over $250,000 a year, do you really need to offer that much money to hire a qualified chief? Or is that the difference between the quality of the candidate that you would get from a Washington, somebody with Washington experience versus somebody coming from an out-of-state system, so different as to justify that? And at least from the media and the public, the answer has been a resounding no. That there's been a very visceral negative reaction to these types of cases in all of the other plans. DuPont is sort of just the first time now that it's come up with respect to Left 2. So that's where you guys find yourselves, is kind of dealing with the same issue that the universities and stuff had with the session before last.
Questions? So based on the three options that Paul's put out there, what's your recommendation?
What we'd be looking for is some direction from you if you would like us to continue to pursue option 1 or 3, or both, and bring those to you at a future meeting for some kind of follow-up. And then you would still have at least one more meeting to decide whether or not you're going to pursue legislation. This would just be a follow-up. It wouldn't be bringing it back to final. So there'd be a couple more steps before this ends up as board proposed legislation.
Okay. Pat, so move.
Second.
Have a motion and a second.
To clarify, is the motion to bring back both 1 and 3, or just 1 or just 3? Both?
Clarifying for option 1 and 3. Is there any further discussion? Okay. Okay, votes are in and the motion passes.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Next item up on the agenda is the correction legislation. This is a topic that you've heard before, and Ryan gave a presentation on this at the last meeting. We're looking today for you to decide whether you want to move this forward and have us bring you back draft legislation, a final presentation. And, Ryan will review the issue for you, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. For the record, Ryan Frost, research analyst for the board, and this will be pretty short and sweet for the final presentation of the day. It's on corrections legislation. So the issue is that corrections are needed to fix errors and oversights in the statutes. More specifically, the 2005 legislation, which included EMTs in the definition of firefighter, contained an unintentional expiration date of 2013, which basically would expire that entire definition in that year. They recognized this in 2007 and attempted to correct it by saying that Section 2 of that legislation actually expired rather than the entire act. Section 2 specifically had to do with LEF 1 PERS 1 members, EMTs, who wanted to transfer into LEF 1. What's that? It was into LEF 1. So basically what it said was any EMT who was in PERS 1 could leave any service credit attained as a member of PERS 1 and transfer that into LEF 1. So this was, it was Section 2, Part B of that legislation. So anyway, this would have fixed the expiration issue if they just would have said that this act or this section expires rather than saying that the entire act expires. However, later on down in that legislation, they said Section 4 of this, that the entire act once again expired in 2023 rather than the specific section addressing EMTs in LEF 1. So again, they undid the fix in Section 2, which means that EMTs would no longer be eligible for participation in LEF after 2023. So that basically gives us two options. Take no action so that the correction for the definition of firefighter, the EMT specifically, would expire in 2023. Or you can address the EMT expiration date and change specific language in the statutes to eliminate that expiration date. And I'll open it up to any questions.
Questions?
Move to pursue option 2.
Okay, motion a second. Continue on with option 2, move to final. Discussion? Vote for the record. Okay. Wally votes in favor of it. Motion passes. Down to item or number 11 on the agenda for agenda items for future meetings.
Mr. Chair, the October agenda will be devoted exclusively to follow up on the expectation items. Since there were no recommended changes to the long-term economic assumptions, you won't need to follow up on that. If there had been some changes and you were going to take action, doing it before the end of October would have been required, but that's not there. So at this point in time, we'll be talking about expectations with you, hearing from you. There won't be any motions. There won't be any expected board action with respect to policy items at the October meeting, which I'll remind you has been changed to October 16th. You voted to change the date at an earlier meeting. We'll bring back some of the follow-up items in November, and also we'll have a follow-up presentation from the State Investment Board. And then we'll have follow-ups on the two items that you move forward today in November, and then the final action we'll bring back to you in December, along with any other topics that you may move to final. With that, I'd be happy to answer questions.
No questions? Unless anybody has any objections, we'll be in adjournment. Wally, it's time, buddy.
That was left in.
Just got to spread it out a little bit. We're trying to help you out.